IVM.
I want to thank Intel for supporting our show. We're all loving working from home, but let's be honest, there are complications. For example, getting help from IT folks if your PC is down can be challenging because you can't just walk up to them anymore. Well, you'll be happy to hear that I have a solution for you, the Intel vPro platform. The platform comes packed with Intel Active Management technology that lets your IT teams remotely manage your systems and fix the problems without having to go to them. So it means more time getting your work done and less time spent on getting support. Visit intel.in/morewithvpro, that's VPRO, to discover how you can do more of what you want and less of what you don't. If you're listening on the IVM Podcast Android app, click the link that's visible to you now.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to All Things Policy. I'm Aditya Ramanathan. Today, as we sometimes do, we're going to take a step back from the events of the day and instead try and understand our past a little better. Specifically today, we want to talk about the Royal Indian Navy and its exploits in the Second World War and the legacy of its involvement in that conflict. To discuss this, today we're joined by a very special guest, Commodore Odakkal Johnson. Commodore Johnson is a serving naval officer. He's the director of the Maritime Historical Society. He's also the author of the book Timeless Wake, The Legacy of the Royal Indian Navy During World War II, which is a superb and very readable book on the subject. So firstly, welcome, Commodore. It's a great pleasure to have you on All Things Policy.
Thank you, Aditya. It's glad to be here with the Takshashila and especially in light of all that you do. Glad to join this program.
Wonderful, yeah. I'm also joined by my colleague Aditya Pareek. So today you'll have two Adityas on this episode. But I want to start, Commodore Johnson, by maybe setting a little context for our listeners. Firstly, why did you get interested in the Royal Indian Navy? I mean, obviously, Royal Indian Navy is the predecessor to our Indian Navy. But how did the RIN come to be, and what was its state in the eve of war in 1939? How did it fit into the broader strategic picture? I mean, this is a mouthful, but maybe if you just tell us how you got interested and what this RIN actually looked like on the eve of the Second World War.
Yeah, Aditya, that's a great place to start. So let me try and put this both from a personal point as well as from the historical setting. Being in the Navy as part of my readings, both professional and personal, the entire dimension of the maritime sector, including its historical elements, has been a part of mandatory reading and also a personal interest. A few years prior to this project, I was asked to do a paper for the Maritime History Society, and I had a chance to do something related to the Anglo-French wars in the Bay of Bengal. And then it just happened that there was a repeat next year, and I did something about the connect between the Kalinga coast, modern-day Odisha, and Bali in Indonesia. Perhaps two successive interactions with the society led then late Admiral J.G. Nadkarni, who was working on these two projects on the naval uprising and the RIN operations, for a serving officer to write about it so that there is a clear perspective. So that came to me, and then I started looking at it, at the whole subject, because I do not come from a classic history background. But briefly, if I could say this, any study of the Royal Indian Navy during World War II gets set as a event which is timeless across the large naval heritage or the maritime heritage in India. Whether we like it or not, the arrival of Captain West Cotton in 1612 did set a chain of events over the next few centuries that finally transitioned post the World War into what we have as initially the Royal Indian Navy, continue to have that name, and the Indian Navy. So after I did my preliminary work in getting the data for the book, this idea of a wake Now, at sea, a wake is what is left behind when a ship passes. And with technology, you can detect the wake long after a ship has passed. So it's something which is timeless. And my reading convinced me that the Indian naval contribution in World War II was a timeless way in the transition from an earlier history to what would determine the naval capability of India, how Indian Navy would be shaped, how early planners would write. So it was a fascinating account of Indians who took part from North Atlantic to Singapore Straits, from the Arakans, modern day Myanmar, to Madagascar, from the East African coast, and right to the heart of the Indian Ocean. So it was a fascinating canvas almost across the globe. And so that is the setting of this book. And I think I learned more than what probably I have written. So that's a bit of a lead into how I came to write it.
Okay. And what did the RIN look like in 1939? It was a fairly small force at that time, from what I understand. And, it wasn't really set up to fight in a global conflict. So how did it fit into the strategic picture of Britain, because the Royal Indian Navy was at this time in relative decline, but it was still one of the leading navies of the world. Where did the RIN fit into that strategic calculus of the British?
You are asking at something which is very, very significant, and even Britain, which is considered to have a deeply conscious maritime spirit, did not escape from what I call strategic and sea blindness. How I do that is, or how I comment on that is, in the First World War, the Royal Indian Marine, which was a predecessor to the Royal Indian Navy, acquitted with great glory in the Suez in stopping Turkish and German forces to overwhelm the Suez Canal, which would have caused disaster. And Indian contribution through the Lashkars and various coastal communities were part of this force. And they did a great job. But despite that, as soon as the First World War got over, some of the planners just decided that the RIM should go back to kind of survey and that mode. That decline was quite sad. Fortunately, there were a few sea-minded people in the Admiralty, particularly Admiral Morby. Then there was a Rawlinson Committee, a Chatfield Committee. But the sum total is, come 1939, we just had 5 ships which were part, and the RIN was not even responsible for the naval defense of India. Interestingly, with a lot of conversation by the late 1920s, it was decided, well, there will be a Royal Indian Navy. But the bill to pass the Indian Naval Discipline Act failed by one vote. So it, very interestingly, political factors, and then 5 years later, 1934, the Royal Indian Navy got commissioned on 2nd of October in what is today the Naval Dockyard Dispensary in Mumbai. So that was the headquarters of the Flag Officer Commanding Royal Indian Navy. As the war clouds were approaching, somehow the whole concept of what the RIM would do during the war still did not find significance in the planners. All the Royal Indian Navy had the boats called HMIs Clive, Cornwallis and Lawrence, and all 3 of them were sloops commissioned towards the end of the Great War, the World War I, and they were still all set to be decommissioned. There were just 2 boats, HMIs Hindustan and HMIs Indus, which were built in the 1930s, and they just had some 3-pounders and low anti-aircraft guns. It wasn't a force that could have any defense. What is fascinating is, on 3rd of September, when Britain decides that she's joining the war, and Lord Linlithgow, then was Viceroy, declares India at war, and some people didn't like it. Within that day itself, 2 of the ships of the Royal Indian Navy were out on patrol. The ones which were said to be scrapped were the ones first in patrol, and within that first 1 month, all 5 of these boats were in the Persian Gulf, were in East Africa, were patrolling along the Indian naval coast, and the RIN planners and the Commander-in-Chief, the Indian Armed Forces, was forced to commission a lot of ships, take it what we call stuffed ships taken up from trade and merchant ships and crafts, and begin a series of expansion which they could have well said. And the actions of the war would prove that you can never allow sea blindness to cloud the strategic picture. It was true then, it was true historically, as some of our historical accounts would prove. It is true today. Fortunately, today there is better attention, but that was the setting of the strategic setting in the early part of the outbreak of the World War.
Pareek, all yours.
Yeah, first of all, Commodore Sir, let me say that to interact with you is to meet one's hero in real life today. Even though digitally, I am honored to interact with you, sir. So, sir, I just have two brief questions. The Royal Indian Navy's actions in the Second World War included several amazing stories. So, could you tell us in particular about the exploits of HMIS Bengal?
Yes. Let me begin by saying this. I call it the Tiger Tail Bengal Bravery, and you could read it in chapter 10 of the book. It's a classic David versus Goliath story. Briefly to put the background, HMIS Bengal was a Bathurst-class minesweeper which was built in Australia for the Royal Indian Navy. And somewhere in the middle of 1942, under the command of Lieutenant Commander W.J. Wilson of Royal Indian Naval Reserves, along with a number of Indian sailors, had gone to what is today Fremantle in Perth, Western Australia. This minesweeper was just 650 tons, which is, if you have actually seen vessels close by, it's not a very large ship. And in its very maiden passage from Fremantle to India, it was given the task of escorting merchant vessel Ondina, which was a Dutch tanker on passage to Diego Garcia in the Indian Ocean. And on 11th of November, when she was some 1,000 miles southwest of Java, Bengal sighted in horizon a contact coming, and she had no other information. Long story short, this vessel ran into two Japanese armed cruisers, one of 8,000 tons and one of 10,000 tons, of the Kunikovo Maru class, two of the vessels which just encountered. And there was a fierce gun battle. Now, a minesweeper is not designed to take across an armed cruiser or even have anti-shipping guns. But Wilson took charge, and Bengal made, there's a classic maneuver in those days, make smoke, and Ondina was told to lie off. Of course, she didn't go anywhere. And this battle royal between the two Japanese cruisers and Bengal, one of the cruisers sank and just vanished. The other one limped across and went back. By the time smoke cleared, there was no one on site. Bengal was hit badly in the after portion, but it could still float, and she escorted Ondina for a while, but then the speeds were very different. And a classic battle. Bengal, maiden passage back to Indian waters. She arrives in Colombo. There is preliminary repairs done, and this little Bengal tiger, I call, comes to Bombay to a heroic welcome. People lined the streets. There was a grand public welcome. And it just displays at sea, size doesn't always matter. It's location, it is strategy, it is tactics. So it's a fascinating long account. And in that, the Indian crew were given many of the distinguished awards. And of course, HMIS Bengal went on to prove its work in the Singapore Straits and later minesweeping operations. So a fascinating account. The Interesting part is the first version of the operations in the Royal Indian Navy, which was written in 1961, completely skips Bengal, and I always had this wonder whether it was intentional. But the later version, written by Commander Hastings in 1980s, built on the accounts of the RI and Officers Association, that has Bengal. So I found this story when I was visiting the National Maritime Museum archives in Greenwich, and it was an honor to put this whole story. Classic story, must read, and I wish a separate piece is made on it.
Yeah, that's actually fascinating, and how you do the research on this. But do you have any theories? I want to ask you, sir, about why the story of Bengal was omitted in the first account in 1961?
I don't know, but when I took the project, I decided that I will probe every story. Both the accounts written by Instructor Lieutenant Collins and Commander Hastings were very classic 1960, 1970 mold historical. But the stories were all messed up in terms of timelines and geography and location. So my big job was to sort out and find what is called a twin evidence record. So unless I found 2-3 accounts corroborating, I didn't put it. Bengal is completely missing in the first account unless there's a passing reference which I missed. I don't know, was it just the data being missed, or was it that by the time Commander Hastings write there is data, or is it, I was very clear that I was going to showcase the RIN crew, officers and sailors, especially Indian contribution, because I find often the Indian narrative is quite unsung in many of the colonial records. So I'm not saying a thesis that's the case, but I had the opportunity and I had multiple accounts to corroborate the story, so I went and put a prominent place right in the center of it.
So, sir, as you said that a lot of the Royal Indian Navy's personnel remain unsung for their contribution in the Second World War. So, two names especially spring to mind. One of Vice Admiral Neelkantha Krishnan, who most people, if they read Indian war history, Indian military history, they would remember him as the chief of Eastern Naval Command during the 1971 war. But he, in fact, had an illustrious career during World War II in the Royal Indian Navy as well. And Admiral Bhaskar Soman, who also had a great career in the Second World War in the Royal Indian Navy. So could you tell us a little more in detail about their exploits during the war?
Oh, that will be glad to. And again, on both, I will be very happy as a researcher to give credit to the work that was done before. Admiral Krishnan's son Arjun writes this account in a sailor's story, and I've taken most of the story from there. Of course, I've corroborated it with some parts. Let me share his story first. In fact, then Lieutenant Neelkantha Krishnan is one of the only two officers who was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross. And this is a very interesting story. He was on HMI's Investigator, and by 1941, early August, the ship had been sent to the Persian Gulf. There were operations in Abadan, and many stories were there, and they were with Royal Australian ship called Yara and a frigate Falmouth, and they were there. So in one of these operations, they were off Khurramshahr, and then Lieutenant Krishnan was put in charge of a team on a tugboat, and they approach Khurramshahr, and there are 3-4 gunboats. Now, interestingly, the story is sometimes mixed up, and there is a story that Lieutenant Krishnan killed Admiral of the Persian Navy, which is not true. The boat was named after the admiral. So that's the story. Anyway, he lands up there and he takes his patrol position, and there was then they get detected, and by about 4 in the morning there is firing taking place on the gunboat. So Krishnan with his team, prominently a guy called P.G. Pandey and Suminder Singh, he splits his party into two, and they just enter the gunboat through 2 hatches from 2 different sides. It's a long story, but twice he's surprised and he just turns a few seconds before that out of sheer instinct, and he says in one, I just had a deafening explosion next to my ears. Otherwise, I wouldn't have been here to tell the story. But Krishnan catches the commanding officer of the boat and he threatens him, asks his team to surrender. And then he holds his fist up and says, I have a grenade. Now the CO knew that he was just pulling a fast one. But then with a gun pushed against him, Krishnan's gun, he actually tells his crew to surrender. So it's a commando-like exploit. In the normal naval operations, except for marine commandos, you don't hear of stories like this. But Krishnan, in this fascinating story of bravado and innovativeness, and by his tactics of splitting the team, surrounding it, captured the gunboat, and of course the Allies just take over Khurram Sheher. So that is classic Krishnan, a story of bravado over there. If I come to Bhaskar Soman, again in Bhaskar Soman's case, Major General Shashikant Pitre has written a complete account on Bhaskar Soman. But I am torn between two stories, but let me see if I can share this. You know, one of the first operations the RIN was asked to help was to rescue Berbera, which is along the East Africa, and it was under the Italian occupation. People know that Italians had stormed and taken over modern day Ethiopia. Bhaskar Soman goes with again a boarding party on a boat. They switch off engines, they just row the boat, and his second in command is a tall, tall British sergeant like Petty Officer John Eckersley and 20 sailors. They land on this Italian garrison and find everyone asleep. Okay, so without a shot being fired, they just take over the detachment. But the problem was, they still don't know where the British garrison had been captured. So Bhaskar Soman feigns this kind of, he puts on an air and he mumbles something to John Eckersley, and John Eckersley takes one of the soldiers and takes him behind a wall, and you hear gunshots. And then he again comes and there is some conversation which goes on, and takes a second one. Of course, the soldiers start singing like a canary and they are released. Actually, nobody had been shot. So that kind of thinking on the feet. I won't tell the story of Galileo Galilei, but Bhaskar Soman was also part of a crew that captured an Italian submarine. Literally, the Italians had abandoned it, and he had temporary command of this Italian submarine with a white flag on it. So fascinating accounts. These are some prominent accounts I get. Thinking on their feet, being innovative, being tactically sound, and knowing the overall gravity of the situation. Soman and Krishnan, definitely heroes of the RIN, and made a great contribution to the war victories.
Yeah, what really fascinates me is that the RIN did not just conduct operations in the Indian Ocean, but also as far away as the Atlantic. Can you maybe just tell us briefly what their role was in such faraway waters?
It's true. So in a way, the RIN was not deployed in the North Atlantic, but what happened is, as I mentioned in the start, the existing force levels were grossly insufficient. So the RIN decided to commission 6 sloops, and that is where you have the Sutlej and a whole series of ships So the Admiralty had decided to form something called a Red Sea Force, and the 6 fresh sloops had been commissioned and were built in the UK. Now, before they could leave the UK, they did conduct certain operations and even take part in the Clyde Blitz attack and that part. Now, I haven't written too much of details because the specific contribution is a little thin of what they had physically done. But Sutlej, which was one of the 2 ships which was commissioned, Sutlej, Jamna, and those ships, did take part in the Sicily operations. Actually, North Atlantic was a specific operation, but they took part in Sicily operations. Before the Allies could overrun the continent and embark on it, Satluj, RIN ship, was the lead ship in anti-submarine operations, and they worked extensively. They sailed all the way after arrival in India. They had sailed up over there, and they were part of the East African task, Eastern Task Force, East Mediterranean Task Force, and the overall General Montgomery was the overall commander. And their operations, it's covered in the ocean called Far Seas. So North Atlantic a little bit, Sicily operations quite significant. And what is important is more than the action. There were these young Indian officers and the sailors who would find these war operations which could guide them in planning the Navy of the future. So fascinating work in the North Atlantic and tremendous operations, specific naval operations in Sicily. Of course, there are other operations of Seychelles and other places. Great operational experience through the war times.
Yeah, I mean, just thinking about this operational experience, both of us, Adityas over here, are very deeply interested in military history and especially naval history. And we never cease to be amazed at just how little awareness there is of India's own maritime past, right? I mean, even today, there's fairly little awareness about the RIN in India. But before we close, I want to ask you, historians tell us that colonial India's military expansion in the early 40s during the war was really the first steps towards it becoming a regional power of sorts after independence. So I want to ask you, what impact did the Second World War have on the RIN specifically and on the people who served in it? People like Admiral Krishnan, like Soman. And so what is its broader legacy? And, is how relevant is that to us sitting here today in 2020?
You asked something very, very apt. And let me begin. I mean, I've captured most of this in my closing chapter called A Living Legacy. Let me, before the specifics of the World War, recognize a reality of geography. If you look at the map of the Indian Ocean, the peninsula of India, is a it's geographically very clear where it operates. Whatever you do, the geographical expanse of India and its expanded maritime zone have a sphere of influence that cannot be shied away from. And so the legacy of Indian Navy, which despite constraints has an origin which is shaped by our own maritime heritage and even during the period of experience of what is called the colonial past. We may not relish the colonial component of it, but there was a great experience, and even the British power survived on the contribution of these places. What the World War II did is bring back to focus the importance of naval power, and with that as a core, the larger comprehensive maritime power, which is shipbuilding, ports, a maritime mindedness, education, coastal communities, the fishing sector, the oil and gas. Maritime power is not purely naval. It is actually looking at seas as our extended area and sphere of influence. The World War II experience realized that you could be Indian from your origin and your choice of vocation in the Navy, but you could be operating in the North Atlantic, you could be operating in the Singapore Straits, or if you were on HMIS Godavari, you could be doing a long chase of a carrier taking you all the way up to Seychelles. Today, whether it is the recent motor tanker New Diamond incident, where was a fire, the Navy along with neighboring countries and the Coast Guard comes together to rescue. You have an incident that takes place in Mauritius and you have Indian naval ship Nirikshak over there. The sea is a place where there is scope for everyone. And I think we have to take our rightful legacy. The experience of the World War gave our early planners clarity of the scale and scope of this project. We just recently have been mourning as Virat has gone towards the scrapyard. But we thought of a carrier even before India got independence, because the planners had seen what a carrier could do. We started thinking of submarines long before we actually approached the Foxtrot submarines. So what significance the RIN in World War II did is it opened up our minds to the possibility of what India needs. Today, the best tribute to that legacy is to take it forward. Fortunately, over the last maybe a decade and a half, there is a resurgence of maritime thought. There is a recognition that it needs. The actual shape may be constrained by various factors. But I think the best tribute is India must never look back or step back from its clear march towards a maritime future. India is a maritime nation, and our history and our legacy talks about it. That the best tribute is to take it forward and become in all dimensions. Yes, naval power, but all elements of maritime dimension. So that is what I would say is the true legacy of RIN in world.
Amazing. Yeah. I mean, we in Takshashila also firmly believe that India has to not only understand and embrace its maritime heritage, but also embrace its maritime future, as you pointed out. But yeah, thank you so much, Commodore. This has been a really fascinating discussion, as expected. And we're so glad to have you here and to talk about this book and to talk about the RIN and to get these ideas and these stories out to a wider audience. Now, listeners, if you're ever even remotely interested in military history, do check out Commodore Johnson's book. It's called Timeless Way. We'll have a link to it in the description. You definitely check it out. All right. Once again, thank you so much, Commodore.
Thank you, Aditya and Aditya, for the conversation.
It's an honor to have you, sir.
So let me just close this line. We have this tagline, which is my best closing comment to everyone. Let heritage awaken our maritime consciousness. That would be our appeal to the larger audience.
Great. Yes, that's something I can definitely get behind. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right. And thank you all for joining us on All Things Policy.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.
I hope you enjoyed that show. I'd like to thank our sponsors this week, Intel, for supporting us. Great week on the network. If you haven't been listening, why haven't you been listening? You should be listening. Rohan Joshi was on Uncle Please Sit, discussed the toxicity of the Indian pop culture. Really fun conversation to listen to. Rajiv Samant, the founder of Sula Wines, was on Cyrus Says. Again, I think that was a fun conversation. Also want to call out the season finale of Yuddha. Yuddha is our military history podcast. Definitely do check that out. It's a really great listen. And finally, I want to just remind you all that, it's a dark time, but if you need a smile, go check out the Smile India podcast by Shifa Mehta. It's in both English and Hindi, and I think that you will really enjoy the kinds of things that she's talking about there. And with that, I hope to see you again next week.
Namaskar, this is Ashish Vidyarthi. Yes, my friend, these are challenging times, but in these challenging times, we can create something extraordinary. Do take time to listen to my podcast, Begin the Journey, available on the IVM Podcast, website, app, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Remember, we have a great opportunity called life. Cheers.